Hey everyone, we're going to see how easy it is to scale Couchbase Server both up and down. So what I mean by this is, let's say you're using Couchbase Server, which is a database, and your demand against your database increases. So your application experiences a lot more load over time, and you feel like you need to expand it. We're going to see how to scale up a Couchbase cluster, so add more resources to your cluster. And then we're going to go about the scenario on, well, what if the demand on your cluster decreases? So maybe your applications see a lot less traffic. We're going to see how to scale down your cluster. And the importance of this is, well, we want to see, well, how easy it is to scale Couchbase Server and actually how much you're actually going to be saving, because you don't want to be paying for more resources than are necessary, and you don't want to have downtime when you perform any of these operations. So this example, we're going to be using Docker. So there is a Couchbase Server official image on Docker Hub. We're going to be using Docker because I'm going to be doing everything locally. But if your Couchbase server is hosted somewhere on AWS or Azure or some bare metal machine that you have somewhere, that's fine too. Again, this is just an example. I'm going to be doing it locally, which is why Docker makes the most sense for this example. So I do have Docker installed. I do have my terminal up. So we're going to be using the Docker CLI to launch a few Couchbase nodes. So we're going to say Docker run. We're going to do it in detached mode. We're going to say port. The host port is going to be 7091, and that's going to map to the container port 8091. And that's the Couchbase administrative dashboard port. There are plenty of other ports for Couchbase Server, but we only need to access the administrative dashboard from our host machine. The containers being on the same container network will be able to communicate via all of those other ports. So we're going to use that port. We're going to give it a name. Let's go ahead and call it Couchbase 1, and let's go ahead and use Couchbase/server as our Docker image. So that's one node created. We're going to make a minor change for our second node. We're going to call it Couchbase 2. This time around, our port is going to be 8091. We're going to add a third one, and we'll call this 9091. And you could keep going. The trend is going to be the same. So we have 3 nodes of Couchbase that are unconfigured and unused at the moment. So let's go ahead and go to our web browser. We're going to create a new tab. We're going to say localhost 7091. And this is actually a first configuration. So we have the opportunity to use either a set up new cluster or join an existing cluster. For this one, we're going to start our new cluster up. We're going to give it a name. I'm going to call it Enraboy. Username and password, go ahead and create one. This is your administrative username and password. Go ahead and accept the terms. We'll go ahead and configure the disk and memory. Since I'm going to be having a lot of instances here, I'm going to give it a lot lower on the specs. But definitely figure out what you need for your production environment, because everything's going to be treated differently. I'm going to uncheck this. I don't need notifications. I'm going to leave standard global secondary indexes. And I'm going to do save and finish. So that setup of Couchbase Server was pretty easy if you've never done it before. It was a very quick wizard. We don't have any buckets currently. We do want a bucket for this example just to show how everything operates. So I'm going to go to settings. I'm going to go to sample buckets, and I'm just going to go ahead and spin up the beer sample bucket. And that has around 7,000 records in it. And we can verify that by going to buckets. It's currently getting set up. So if I refresh, yeah, so 7,303. That looks like the accurate number. And this is important for the next step. So with our single node cluster created, we're going to worry about adding a new node. So we're at a point, maybe somebody tweets about us that's famous, and now our application is booming. So our one node cluster can't handle the load anymore. So we're going to open up a new tab here. We're going to say localhost 8091, which is one of our other Docker containers. This time around, instead of saying set up new cluster, I'm going to say join an existing cluster. And I will need to provide it a host name. So if you are using Docker, like I am, you can't just provide localhost because we're working with containers here on a container network. So there's plenty of different ways to figure out what the actual IP address is of your container. The easiest for the Couchbase circumstance is to go to your previous cluster here and get it from the list of servers. So just copy and paste that. We're going to use that as our IP address. Administrator, I left it as that. I'm going to type in my password, and I'm just going to join it with the default configuration. All right, so I just added that node to the cluster. So this is a peer-to-peer cluster. So there is no master slave node. There is no shard node, replica node. There's just one type of node here. So I can actually connect to any of the two nodes in this cluster, and I'll be given the same information. So let's go ahead and close this tab. We can actually go back to our server list, and you'll see new node not taking any traffic. So when you add a new node, what you have to do is you have to rebalance the cluster. So what that means is we need to reshuffle our data so that way it's evenly distributed across our cluster. So our 7,300 records needs to be distributed across these two nodes. So what we want to do is we want to do what's called a rebalance. So we'll click it. It'll take a variable amount of time depending on how much data it's moving around or what your specs are as far as your nodes. Now, when we're doing this rebalance, our server, our database is online. We don't need to bring it offline to make this happen. So if we have an application using Couchbase, whether that be with Java or Node or something else, it's still working. We don't have to bring it down like a relational database or a vertically scaled database because it's a cluster. It's distributed. So we'll let this finish for a second. So the rebalance did complete. And like I said, it's a variable amount of time depending on your specs and what's going on. But you don't have to worry because it's online, like I said. So if we go to buckets, we'll see that, let me refresh here. We have our same amount of documents. You saw a higher number because stuff was being shuffled around and it just hadn't updated the screen yet. But if we click on this, there is one replica set. So our documents are replicated across the two buckets. So that way, in the event of a failover situation, your data will still be served from one of those nodes. So let's go back to servers. Let's say, you know what? Our cluster is now getting an even higher amount of traffic. The demand has increased yet again. So we're going to see a different way that you can add a node to your cluster. So again, let me make this clear. This is a different way. So you have options when it comes to scaling up your cluster. Let's go ahead and go to our other node here. So let's go to localhost and we'll say 9091. This time around, instead of saying join existing cluster, let's say that we already had a new cluster. So let's set up another cluster. We'll call this nrboy2. We'll give it a username and password. It can be very different if you want it to be. We'll say accept the terms. I accept. Let's configure all of this disk and memory. We could actually, yeah, let's go ahead and configure it. We'll configure it with the same. We'll uncheck the updates, click finish. We can confirm that this is a single node cluster again. It's a different cluster name. So what we want to do now is let's just copy this host. So let's copy this container IP, go back into our first cluster. Instead of doing the join cluster, we're going to say add server. I'm going to paste in that IP address. I'm going to enter the username and password of that other cluster. I'm going to signify the services that I want to use, and I also want to take note that that cluster is going to be wiped out. So when you do this, do it with in mind that your cluster is going to be erased. So let's go ahead and add that server. And you'll see that it is now added. And it relogged me out here because now it's a part of a different cluster. So I have to log in again. So I just closed that tab. We can see we need another rebalance because our data needs to be resharded across the cluster. So let's go ahead and click it. So as you can see that the rebalance did finish, again in a variable amount of time. I did not need to take my cluster offline. The cluster was fully accessible by any of my applications that were trying to access it. So I was able to scale up again to meet the demand of my applications. So let's go ahead and go with the assumption now that, you know what, maybe our traffic died down. Maybe we're running an e-commerce site. We scaled up because it was end of the year. There was a lot of holiday shopping. Now let's say that the holidays are over. Our application is seeing less demand. So instead of having to pay for all of these servers to keep them online, because servers, depending on your setup, could be very expensive, we want to start removing them to best fit the needs of our application. We want to try to fit it as best as possible. So let's go ahead and remove one of these nodes. And it's very easy with Couchbase, super easy. So when you click on one of the servers, what we want to do is we want to click remove. You'll notice that there are two buttons, one's for remove, one's for failover. I won't get too much into the failover side of things in this video, but failover is more for maintenance. We don't want to do maintenance. We want to do a full removal. So what we can actually do is we can click remove. We will have to note that the cache capacity will be reduced. Of course, our resources will be reduced when we do this. Just take into consideration, you have to note that when you do this, will your database still be able to accommodate the current demand? So if it can, go ahead and click remove server. It is not removed yet. So remember, our data is sharded across that cluster. So what we want to do is when we're doing a removal, we need to make sure that that data that's on this pending removal node is put back on one of these other nodes. And that's done through a rebalance again. So what we can do is we click rebalance. And then the rebalance starts the same way that it did in the previous example. So it's the database is online, can still be accessed, but yet we're removing one of the nodes. So as you can see, the rebalance has finished. One node was removed. We look at our buckets. Everything looks intact here as far as our documents, but yet we were able to scale. So if you were to do this with any other database, whether that be relational or NoSQL, you would find yourself having a much more difficult time. Now, you saw everything that I did was with the UI. You don't have to do it with the UI. Couchbase does have RESTful APIs that you can use to do this, so you can use curl if you wanted to. You can also use the Couchbase CLI tool, which will allow you to do the same thing as well. But from a UI perspective, it was just a few clicks and we were able to scale up and down without any issues.